So good morning to our speaker and good afternoon everyone here in the Asian time zone. I am assuming that everything is working, the tone is clarified, and I welcome you hereby to this online lecture series of the Institute for Sino-Christian Studies, today on the topic and on laughter and love. My name is Thomas Coendet, and I'm a professor of law at Shanghai Jiaotong University, having here a chair that is called an Oriental chair, which is suitable to part of my research, as I'm recently particularly interested in the concept of legal Orientalism, which is the imagination of the Asian, notably the Chinese law in the Western, from the Western perspective. Besides my interest in legal theory, I also have a particular interest in private law, and I'm very glad to take up this opportunity here to comment, to act as a moderator and commentator for this session. Having been a visitor at the ISCS for several times now, and to me that's always a wonderful experience, as the scholarly discussion there is always very in a free spirit across disciplines and across philosophical and religious traditions. Now it is my pleasure to introduce to you our speaker of today, Professor Ola Sigurdson. He is a professor of systematic theology at the University of Gothenburg, and there he is affiliated with the Department of Literature, the History of Ideas and Religion. He held visiting positions at many other distinguished academic institutions, among others the University of Cambridge and the Center of Theological Inquiry at Princeton. In 2019, he acted as a guest professor at the Institute of Sino and Christian Studies in Hong Kong. Professor Sigurdson's research focuses on the intersection of traditional systematic theology and continental theory. He is a most prolific writer, has written more than 20 books, both in Swedish and English. To only mention his most recent book, entitled Divine Comedies, which is a 3-volume work charting the relation between humor, subjectivity, and transcendence. His research has won him numerous awards and prizes, among others a Fulbright Scholarship and the Karin Giro Prize, awarded by the Swedish Academy. Now we will have the following setup or format for this lecture. We will start with the lecture of our distinguished speaker for about an hour. This will be followed by a response of myself for about 10 minutes, which is then followed by a Q&A session for about 30 minutes. You are, however, invited to raise questions already during the lectures if you want to do so. You also, of course, are encouraged to raise your question in English. However, for those of you who do not feel comfortable to do so, we have arranged the possibility that you may raise your questions in Chinese, and we will help then to translate them into English. Now, I hand over quickly to Mao Zhang to somehow introduce the particularities of that process to you in Chinese. So Mao Zhang, if you would please take over.
Okay, thank you, Thomas. 同学们，就是刚才 Thomas 老师说的意思，就是说在讲座1个小时结束之后，会有10分钟的他的 response， 然后之后是30分钟的 Q&A 的时间。这个 Q&A 的时间是给大家提问的，大家可以在那个讲座期间随时进行提问，就是通过那个下面的Q&A 的这个按钮。在这里提问，这里提问的时候，同学们可以用中文，也可以用英文来提问。就是如果觉得英文不方便的话，可以用中文，这样我会把大家的中文的提问翻译成英文，再交给2位老师。同学们提问题的时候，可以向2位老师中任何一个来提问。 如果没有特别指明的话，就这些问题就会交给老师来选择，让他们选择谁想进行回答。就是这样。Okay, that's the tips for Q&A. Thank you, Thomas.
Okay, very nice. Thank you so much, Marjan. And then without further ado, I hand over to our speaker, Professor Sigurdson. The screen is yours.
Thank you very much for this kind introduction. I'm very honored to become a guest professor at the ISCS again. Although I would much rather have joined you in China than just speaking through Zoom, but this is as it is, and I hope to return at some later stage. Thomas gave the background for this talk. It's a 3-volume work that I'm just about to publish in Swedish, unfortunately. I'm from Sweden, and we speak a very small language, which is also my native language, and which is what I do write my books in. But it will be translated at some point, I hope. And it's a 3-volume work where I discuss the question of human subjectivity from the perspective of humor, with the help of philosophical anthropology, psychoanalysis, and theology. And the books, as I am also this very talk, is from a very Western perspective. I'm quite aware of that, and maybe we can address that in the Q&A later on. So let me begin the talk. Is there a laughter of love? In the history of reflection on humorous laughter, an understanding of laughter as antagonistic has been prevalent, at least since classical antiquity. The laughing person has been understood as someone who, in control of her or himself, laughs at someone else. Out of concern for the object of laughter, such laughter has understandably been criticized as unable to stem from a genuine concern or even love for the other. It was not until 18th century Britain that an understanding of laughter as sympathetic was developed. A genuine humorous laughter is always a laughter with someone, according to those. Laughter at someone thus came to be understood as corrupted laughter. The phenomenological question, however, is whether or not these two alternatives both fail to come to terms with a more complex reality of laughter, reality of humorous laughter. Is there not a possibility of a sincere laughter of love? That is, a laughter that is, while being a laughter of genuine concern for the other, still might not be reduced to just a mutual assent. Or to put it slightly different, is there a laughter that might tickle or wound the other's self in a way that can drive the other out of her or himself, but where this failure of self-possession still would not mean losing oneself, a kind of radical destitution of the self, as it takes place against the horizon of an ultimate trust that one would get oneself back? Such questions will guide this inquiry about the possibility of a laughter of love, an inquiry that is of concern not only for the possibility as such, but also for a fundamental issue of a philosophical or theological anthropology. What kind of being must a human being be to be able to find something funny? Now, there are many kinds of laughter. Nervous laughter, spiteful laughter, laughter of delight or euphoria, nitrous oxide-induced laughter, aggressive laughter, just to name a few. Of all these varieties of laughter, the kind of laughter that has been repeatedly highlighted since the classical age is antagonistic, aggressive laughter. Looking at ancient philosophy and rhetoric, thinkers such as Aristotle, Plato, and Cicero all agree that there is an aggressive dimension to laughter, which is why the cultivated gentleman prefers not to be laughed at, but only himself laugh at someone. Patristic theologians, such as Clement of Alexandria and John Chrysostom, agree, and all the way up to the English philosopher Thomas Hobbes in the 17th century with his famous definition of laughter as a sudden glory arising from a sudden conception of some eminency in ourself by comparison with the infirmities of others. Most philosophers and theologians think that laughter is, in most cases, antagonistic. Of course, there is a difference between, for instance, Aristotle and Hobbes, as Aristotle's reason for laughter is to be found more in the defect of the other than the superiority of oneself, as in Hobbes, but nevertheless they agree upon the antagonistic nature of laughter. According to Aristotle, in his The Art of Rhetoric, the definition of the kind of wit that makes us laugh is cultured insolence. Pepaidevemene hybris in Greek. It is, however, essential that the rudeness remain cultured. Anything stronger than just a modest laughter puts the laugher at risk of losing his self-restraint. Self-control, enkrateia, is a central manly virtue, according to Aristotle in the 7th book of his Nicomachean Ethics, to be contrasted with akrasia, the vice of unrestraint. To be sure, it is forgivable if someone like Xenophantus, and I quote, who tried to restrain their laughter explode in one great guffaw, end of quote. But the constantly amused shows a lack of character, like the buffoon who has lost the mastery over himself and therefore does not rule over his own bodily passions. To be laughed at would be to assume the position of the buffoon, which is out of the question for Aristotle's cultivated gentleman. But to laugh at someone is of course perfectly possible for the cultivated gentleman, as long as this laughter stays within the bounds of the appropriate and fitting. Self-restraint or self-control is all important. To be the butt of someone's joke means to have already lost it. Again, the gentleman who loses himself in laughter risks losing his gentlemanly status, as does the gentleman who loses himself in laughter as does the gentleman who becomes the object of laughter, as both of these become a threat to the necessary self-restraint. Within the asymmetric relationship between the laugher and the laughee, however, it is always best to be on the side of the laugher. This kind of laughter that is suitable varies according to age and situation, however. Young men love laughter more than grumpy old men, according to Aristotle. And a group of friends can playfully make use of cultured insolence without impinging on each other's honor. But the reason that it is more prudent to laugh at someone else than being laughed at remains, since to laugh with an aggressive or insolent laughter means being on top in an asymmetric relationship where one's self-control is not being threatened. It is quite clear, I think, that Aristotle's attitude towards laughter is determined by more profound concerns regarding subjectivity. To be in full possession of one's own self is a central virtue, not only for Aristotle, but for most of the ethical reflection of classical philosophy. Even if it is not as bad to laugh immodestly as being laughed at, laughing in itself carries a certain risk of losing one's composure. Compare this quote from Caterina de Medici's personal physician Laurent Joubert from many centuries later, who illustrates this perennial risk, and I quote, "Everybody sees clearly that in laughter the face is moving, the mouth widens, the eyes sparkle and tear, the cheeks redden, the breast heaves, the voice becomes interrupted. And when it goes on for a long time, the veins in the throat become enlarged, The arms shake and the legs dance about. The belly pulls in and feels considerable pain. We cough, perspire, piss and besmirch ourselves by dint of laughing, and sometimes we even faint away because of it. This need not be proven. I take it for certain and approved by all. This quite graphic rendering of what happens if we laugh exemplifies one experience of how we can be carried away by laughter. What starts as just a giggle might end up by losing one's prudence entirely. Thus, it is not just the prospect of being laughed at that threatens the self-control of the gentleman, but laughter itself. As long as the virtue of self-control is respected, laughter and mirth are to be commended, including the dual ability to make and take a joke, even if that would amount to for a while being the butt of the joke. In the company of friends, where, as Aristotle says, each has the same end in view as his neighbour, being able to take a joke and return it in good taste is appreciated. In other words, laughter is still aggressive, but such banter among good friends is, as Stephen Halliwell puts it, a transmuting of aggression into play. Modesty is to be recommended on all accounts. Aristotle is of course only an example, but a good example of the tendency to regard all laughter as aggressive. He's a good example since the laughter that he thinks is to be commended is, however modest and prudent, still an aggressive laughter. Even when exercised among friends, and consequently in some way a reciprocal laughter, it needs to be reined in, so as not to turn friendship into enmity. Other thinkers, as for example the church father John Chrysostom, were even more careful with regard to laughter's aggressive propensities, suggesting that it perhaps is better to avoid it altogether. John Chrysostomos is, compared to Aristotle, more worried about the asymmetric characteristics of aggressive laughter, perhaps sensitized by the scenes of the mocking of Christ in the Gospels, as well as the persecution of Christianity in the centuries just before his own time. Nevertheless, he is at one with Aristotle about the possibilities of laughter to disturb or overthrow the self-control of the subject. Irrespective of regarding modest laughter as permissible or taking an even more restrictive view on laughter, the emphasis on self-control remains. This emphasis is slightly more problematic in John Chrysostom than in Aristotle, as he has to recognize as a Christian that a human being cannot be in control of what ultimately matters, namely the reception of grace. For grace to be received as grace, that is, the gratuitous reception of a gift and not something that is owed to the subject, the self has to give up some of its power to control the transactions between itself and the other. The self is reconfigured by Christian theology in the sense of being a genuine self, even as a passive, receiving or even suffering self, rather than preferably an active or controlling self. And that reconfiguration is slowly being worked out in the course of history, even with regard to laughter. To John Chrysostom, however, laughter still threatens the integrity of the self. It was not until the 18th century that the notion of aggressive laughter got serious competition. Not seldom as a direct response to Thomas Hobbes, a number of British philosophers suggested that, far from always being aggressive, laughter is an expression of mutual sympathy. The philosopher Adam Smith, whose theory of moral sentiments from 1759 advocated the ideal of mutual sympathy, thought that laughter could not foster such an ideal. But philosophers like James Beattie, Francis Hutcheson and Lord Shaftesbury, journals like The Tatler or The Spectator, as well as authors like Henry Fielding thought otherwise. Central to their claim was some kind of distinction between a good and a bad laughter. Hutcheson distinguished between laughter and ridicule. Beattie drew the line between innocent mirth and unseasonable buffoonery, and a number of thinkers thought that humour and wit were different species. Their point was, consequently, not that aggressive laughter did not exist, but that there also was another laughter, a sympathetic laughter, born of a fellow perception of something ludicrous, emphatically not a deformity in someone else, but rather a form of a perceived incongruity in how things are. This sympathetic laughter was the natural laughter, as the feeling of sympathy was the natural feeling, unlike unnatural antipathy or unnatural aggressive laughter. It was thus imperative to have a good judgment of when laughter could be considered to be prudent, so as not to fall into perverted laughter. The Scottish Enlightenment philosopher Hutcheson could even allow for a mild form of ridicule against the horizon of mutual sympathy, as when an already established bond of friendship between the laugher and the laughee made sure that the laughable shortcomings of the latter did not intrude on the friendship. This laughter, however, must be perceived to flow from kindness and not the opposite. Hutcheson here comes close to what Aristotle has to say about laughter among friends, that some kind of asymmetry could be allowed against a horizon of symmetry. Nevertheless, there is a difference between Hutcheson and Aristotle with regard to laughter, and as the former thought of sympathetic laughter as the natural form of laughter and aggressive laughter as a deviation, where it was rather the other way round for the latter. To Aristotle, aggressive laughter is natural, but could be domesticated under certain circumstances. It's not wrong to think that this 18th century British notion of laughter and humour has defined what our contemporary Western world thinks about humour. Humour is often seen as something good, something natural, something that characterizes the tolerant mind, whereas whatever is aggressive is defined as not really being humorous. According to the intellectual historian Daniel Wickberg, humour is today seen as, and I quote, an essential feature of the normal, the sane, the balanced, the healthy personality, end of quote. Whatever its idea about humour and the sympathetic laughter, however, it is decidedly incorrect to suggest that 18th century Britain in general cultivated a particularly sympathetic culture of laughter. On the contrary, as the literary scholar Simon Dickey has shown, the comic literature of the 18th century Britain was anything but sympathetic in its tone, instead reveling in jokes about physical deformities, especially deafness, violence with a particular fondness for jokes about rape and domestic violence, poverty, disease and fraud. According to Dickey, there is a huge gulf between precept and practice in the unsentimental 18th century. And we could of course ask whether or not our own time and its conviction that humour is inherently sympathetic suffers from the same blindness. Be that as it may for now, what interests me here is the possible transformation of the understanding of subjectivity implicit in the differing accounts of laughter. If laughter in the classic tradition is asymmetric, in the sense that the basic laughing relationship is between someone that is laughing at someone else and that someone else that is being laughed at. This relationship is, with the exception of laughter among friends, neither reversible nor reciprocal. If the laugher would turn into the laughee, that would be counted as an unfortunate circumstance. In the latter British tradition, however, the relationship is symmetric. True natural laughter is to take place as a part of the mutual sympathy among friends. Laughter is no longer understood, at least officially, to be directed at other human beings, but instead at some perceived incongruity between things of some sort, or at a purely linguistic incongruity. Even here, as I mentioned, friendship allows for a slightly different accent, where symmetry is allowed within the shared and more basic symmetry. Still, the emphasis in this idea of sympathetic laughter is that you are laughing with someone, not at someone. It is a symmetric rather than an asymmetric relationship. Even though the idea of laughter has changed since the classical age, some things about laughter has not changed. In the classical tradition, the subjectivity of the laugher was defined by self-control. The reason that the laughter of the laugher should not be too violent but modest was that the laugher should not lose control. And this was also the reason that the laugher should not turn into an object of laughter. Now, even in the sympathetic understanding of laughter, self-control is implicit. Care has to be taken, again in theory, so as not to ridicule or wound the other, bringing him or her to lose face. If the asymmetric laughter of the classical tradition presupposed that there was no harm in laughing at someone that is inferior, infringing upon the subjectivity in ways that might cause them to forfeit their self-control, the symmetric laughter of the British tradition instead let all the participants in the laughing relationship keep their self-control. The object of laughter therefore moved out of the interpersonal relationship as such, instead sticking to an incongruent object, like the Australian duck-billed platypus, a kind of beaver with a duck beak. Of course, for both Aristotle and Hutcheson, laughter among friends seems to be the exception. Laughter among friends takes the hostility out of aggressive laughter against a mutual horizon of trust, or, in the later version, allows for a moment of ridicule within the larger scope of mutual sympathy. Under certain circumstances, then, the self-controlled subject could without fear allow for some loss of control. Phenomenologically speaking, the experience that is contained in these exceptions might be worth exploring, as it seems to hint at an experience that transcends the purely asymmetric or purely symmetric relationship, and therefore also a subjectivity that is not primarily understood in terms of self-control. This will bring us to look at not only friendship in Greek philia, but also love in Greek agape or eros, as possible forms of this subjectivity beyond self-control. In some way or other, love is other-related. To put it in another way, love is a form of the relationship between self and the other, which means that not only the other is figured in distinct ways by love, but also the self. Even self-love could be understood as other-related, in that the self relates to itself as another. Narcissus famously fell in love with his own reflection. Thus, a minimal distinction between the self and the reflection of the self is introduced in the narcissistic self. Further, this relationship between self and other, now meaning the other in a more concrete sense, this relationship that we call love can appear in quite different forms, which is reflected in the several terms for love that we find, for example, in Greek: philia, agape, and eros. I will use friendship, philia, as a first example, since I already have mentioned it repeatedly. For Aristotle, as noted, friendship should be understood as reciprocal and symmetric. As the philosopher says in his Nicomachean Ethics, Book 8, and I quote, "To be friends, men must feel goodwill for each other, that is, wish each other's good, and be aware of each other's goodwill, and the cause of their goodwill must be one of the lovable qualities, that is, what is good or pleasant or useful." End of quote. Friendship that is based on only pleasure or utility, however, is dissolved as soon as the motive for friendship disappears. It is only the friendship based on virtue that is a perfect form of friendship, since here it is between the good and those who resemble each other in virtue, according to Aristotle. There is in friendships based on virtue a reciprocity, both in terms of giving and receiving, unlike then friendships based on pleasure or utility, since those friendships are based not on a reciprocal giving and receiving, but in the end only on what the self can get out of the other. Thus, friendships based on pleasure or utility do not find the other lovable in her or himself, but only as a means for one's own pleasure or utility. True friendship is a friendship between equals, which means that the genuinely friendly relationship is not only reciprocal but symmetric. It is not only a contractual symmetry, however, as the friendly self bestows upon the friendly other, not according to desert, but according to possibility. The reciprocity between friends allows for a certain excessive asymmetry then, but only within the bounds of a more fundamental symmetry, so to speak. This is also why genuine friendship primarily takes place between free men. Even if friendship between, for instance, husband and wife is possible, this is an unequal and, we may assume, secondary friendship for Aristotle. In true friendship, friends are not dependent upon each other, nor do the giving and receiving between friends compromise the standing as men in possession of themselves. I shall return to the question of love as friendship and the kind of subjectivity that is implied by Aristotle's account of it soon. But let me first also say something about the two other forms of love mentioned, eros and agape. This is a pair that has been taken to be contrasting through the work of the Swedish theologian Anders Nygren and his book Agape and Eros, originally written in Swedish in the 1930s, but subsequently translated into several languages and earning quite some repute. I think it's even translated into Cantonese. As will be clear, I think the distinction between Eros and Agape by Nygren is exaggerated. But as a typological exercise, it can make us aware of liminal forms of the experience of love that the two terms signify. Paradigmatic forms of Eros and Agape are found in Plato and St. Paul. I shall, however, disregard here both the historical context for these paradigmatic forms of love, as well as the question whether Nygren's interpretation of them really is correct, instead focusing on his antithetical configuration of the paradigmatic and typological form as he presents them. According to Nygren, then, the main difference between Eros and Agape equals a difference between an egocentric attitude, in a non-moral sense, and a theocentric attitude, where the former is the ego's own desire for God, and the latter stands for a spontaneous and unmotivated kind of love that is indeed indifferent to value. Agape, according to Nygren, does not look for anything in man that could be adduced as motivation for it. It is directly opposed to all rational computation and calculation. Compared to my account of friendship that I just gave, agapeic love is quite distinct in that it does not find its motivation in any of the lovable qualities of the other. Quite the contrary, in a sense, there is no motivation at all for such a love, but only pure spontaneity. This is quite the opposite to Eros, which is, according to Nygren, characterized by a desire, a longing, a striving. The human being only desires and longs for that which he has not got and of which he feels a need, and he can only strive for that which he feels to be valuable. Erotic love is not only motivated by something that it finds lovable, but it is, as Nygren puts it, acquisitive, in the sense that it wants to take possession of that which it finds lovable. This has consequences for how subjectivity is regarded according to the different forms of love. With regard to eros, it is the human subject that is active and the loving and the it is the human subject that is active and the loving, and the object of love is passive. With regard to agape, on the contrary, it is the human self that is passive and God who is active. Erotic love tries to fill a need, a lack in the self, whereas agapeic love is completely undeserved or perhaps even unwanted by the self. The emphasis then in erotic love is on what the self receives or hopes to receive, whereas in agapeic love it is on what the self gives. Of course, in agapeic love, it is not really the human being itself that is the active subject of love, but God himself, according to Nygren, yet in such a way that the divine love employs man as its instrument and organ. Nygren actually goes at lengths to express the passivity of the self in agapeic love, saying that the self has nothing of its own to give, and I quote, "In relation to God and his neighbour, the Christian can be likened to a tube, which by faith is open upwards and by love downwards." End of quote. The image of the tube, of course, is meant to convey an utter passivity. To put this distinction in the terms that I've been using already, both agapeic and erotic love are asymmetric. In the latter, there is a lack in the self that only the other can fill. There is a qualitative difference between being on the receiving and on the giving side. As Michel Foucault puts it, there was an accepted convention in the classical age that the eros came from the lover. As for the beloved, he could not be an active subject of love and on the same basis as the one who's receiving, who is giving the love. Agapeic love, on the other hand, is also asymmetric but the other way round. Only God can truly be an active subject of love, which means that human beings are in the position of being passive objects of love. On the human side of the relation, love can only consist in receiving, not giving, except, that is, as an instrument and organ of God's love. But it is a receiving without wanting. To want something would mean to reach out for it, even if in thoughts only, which would be an activity of desire. The proper mode of receiving agapeic love is through faith, which means believing and trusting, not wanting. There is a historical shift through Christianity of how activity and passivity was valued in terms of anthropology that might complicate things for this neat distinction between eros and agape. But as for now, let us stick with this typology by pointing out that the human being, as the receiver of agapeic love, can no longer be considered as a self-controlled agent, but has to give up his or her self-control to be able to become the recipient of love and grace. The erotic lover, however, should avoid being carried away by his desire of the loved one, lest he loses his self-control. In principle, the lover occupies the same hierarchical relation towards the loved one in the classical tradition as the laugher to the laughee. But at the same time, this self-control is incessantly precarious and needs to be cultivated through a deliberate training, so that, in his search for pleasure, the lover does not succumb to the loved one in his yearning for love, but remains in control. The ideal is not to be free of desires altogether, but to desire with one's integrity intact. Self-mastery was a way of being a man with respect to oneself, according to Foucault, and to lose that mastery was to lose one's integrity as a man. Thus, both agape and eros imply a certain asymmetry. This asymmetry is emphasized, although in different ways, as to the point that it becomes hard to understand whether there is a possibility of some kind of reciprocity, as in friendship. In pure agapic love, neither yearning for nor returning God's love are, strictly speaking, possible, as this would mean that the pure passivity of the loved is compromised. Erotic love, in the way I've described it here, is not as strict, perhaps, but there is still a distinctive hierarchy between the active lover and the pursued object of love. This hierarchy can, to be sure, be tempered, but that means that erotic love gives way to friendship, and it cannot be understood as reciprocal without compromising the asymmetry between self and other. However, is there not a possibility of losing oneself, but nevertheless returning to oneself as an other? Is there not, in love, the possible experience of a reconstitution of subjectivity, so that I cannot be the same after love as I was before? Friendship, as I've described it with the help of Aristotle, do have a streak of this possibility of an asymmetric reciprocity, in that it allows for an asymmetry, even if it never ventures out of the bounds of a symmetric reciprocity. Good friends are each other's peers in Aristotle's understanding, so there is no question of leaving one's comfort zone by befriending one's enemy, so to speak. But is there not a more radical asymmetric reciprocity in some ordinary experience of love? There are, of course, some biblical stories that are centered around the experience of gaining oneself through losing oneself. The parable of the prodigal son, for instance, who frivolously spent his inheritance, but nevertheless is welcomed back despite his destitution by his father. Or the story of the crucifixion, death and resurrection of Jesus Christ describes a similar trajectory and a relationality of love that could neither be reduced to an agapic nor to an erotic love in the way I've presented them here. If agapic love is, as Nygren has it, centered around the other, whereas erotic love is centered around the self, the movement or direction of both these concepts of love are too unilateral to adequately render the loss of self under the aegis of a hope of a return to self as other. To love someone, as in ordinary everyday love, not only in these biblical stories, because of their inherent loveliness, and with the hope of having that love reciprocated, is neither, contra Nygren, egocentric nor other-centric, but an example of a relationality of excess. It is an example of a creative discovery which transgress any all-too-neat hierarchy between self and other, without doing away with the asymmetry that is a presupposition of genuine otherness. The French philosopher Jean-Luc Marion has presented a phenomenological understanding of love in his The Erotic Phenomenon that points us in this direction. To be sure, he argues explicitly against the possibility of reciprocity in love. He says, reciprocity has nothing to do with love and befits only the economy and calculation of exchange. End of quote. But at the same time, it is clear that Marion understands reciprocity as a tit-for-tat within the economy of exchange, where the excess and spontaneity and risk of love would be lost. Love is, and I quote, to give without return or chance of recovery, and thus to be able to lose and eventually to be lost in love." End of quote. Without the risk of losing oneself in love, the self never dares to take leave of control, but then never experience the chance of being loved by anything else than a symmetric love. In that sense, Negron is correct in wanting to understand agapeic love as directly opposed to all rational computation and calculation. Love is genuine, according to Marion, when it is experienced as something, and I quote, "coming upon me from elsewhere than myself." It thus assigns me an irreversible dependency upon that which I can neither master nor provoke nor even envisage. End of quote. There is an asymmetry to the experience of love. But on the other hand, there is nevertheless a hope for a response. A hope that neither can be reduced to a demand nor a debt, since this would deny the freedom of the love that is hoped for. To hope for love is not to already know or to already possess the love that is hoped for. It is through this free response of love, what Marion calls the properly infinite excess of the lover, this free response of love from the other, that I will receive myself back, but now as another. And Marion writes, "We only love another at the price of a continued recreation, a continuous quasi-creation without end or rest." End of quote. Thus, erotic love is part of this picture too, as there is a lack in the self that the self is hoping that love could remedy. But as this is a constant lack, there is no way that love can become a possession of the yearning self. My thirst will never be slaked once and for all, but only in a continuous receiving. My hope for love is reciprocated in the other's grace. In the experience of a love outside of exchange, and thus more radical than Aristotle's friendship, an asymmetric reciprocity seems to be possible in a way that at the same time as this distinction between agape and eros collapses. As Marion puts it, one must have a good deal of naivete or blindness, or rather know nothing of the lover and of erotic logic, not to see that agape possesses and consumes as much as eros gives up and abandons. End of quote. Of course, here both possessing and consuming as well as giving and abandoning function in the mode of excess, what I call asymmetric reciprocity rather than exchange. To love is to not wanting to be oneself without the other, but such a love is possible only in letting the other remain other as well as becoming other oneself. Unlike in Aristotle's version of friendship, which tends to be understood as a symmetric reciprocity, love is an asymmetric reciprocity, and perhaps the symmetric reciprocity of friendship is possible only against the background, the condition of possibility even, of an asymmetric reciprocity, where love is understood as gift, not as given. The price of love is continued recreation, according to Marion. This means that to find oneself in love is neither pure self-affirmation nor downright disregard of self, but rather a discontinuous continuity where the self in love discovers itself as other and through the other. Such a love, it seems, implies a subjectivity beyond self-control, both because the self puts itself at risk in loving the other, and because the self, in its hope of a response from the other, is prepared to be recreated through the other. In such a loving relationship beyond symmetric reciprocity, is there a space for laughter? If so, what kind of laughter is it? And how does it relate to the subjectivity of the laugher and the laughee? As we have seen, we find a laughter among friends to be possible in both Aristotle and Hutcheson. Despite their differences, Both think of laughter as recreative in another sense than Marion's. Recreation here being understood as refreshment, pastime, play or amusement. When Thomas Aquinas in Summa Theologiae rehabilitates the Aristotelian tradition of wit and laughter in the 13th century, this is precisely what he is thinking of. Even if nothing other is sought in playful or humorous words than the soul's delight, such wit can still be a virtue, since it brings necessary rest and refreshment to the soul. We all need some modest amusements, since the soul tires from its intellectual activities in the same way that the body tires from physical work, and the delight that laughter brings serves as a refreshment. Laughter as recreation, then, does not intrude on the self, but is instrumentalized in the service of the self. Consequently, laughter among friends does not in principle exceed an economy of exchange. This is a part of its value as recreation, but recreation only in the sense of play or amusement, emphatically not recreation in the way that love continuously recreates the self, as the self is never put to risk. It seems that laughter among friends is not a laughter of love, as its possible merits lie elsewhere. What then about an agapeic laughter of love or an erotic laughter of love? As I have suggested, both agapeic and erotic love, at least in the typological understanding of them, are characterized by a unilateral directionality. Agapeic love seems ultimately not to be a human capability or possibility, but if it is taken for such, the lover is someone who only gives but never receives, because agapeic love cannot remain pure if it is hoping for a love returned. This means that the lover remains in control as the giver of love, since the reception of gifted love would imply a passivity that would undo the self-control of the loving self. The other in the agapeic love relationship is reduced, on the other hand, to pure reception, without the capability or possibility to love back. What an agapeic laughter of love would be from the point of view of the loving self becomes hard to imagine, at least if some kind of response from the laughee is essential to the experience of laughter. In a purely unilateral laughter, the laughing self would remain the kind of self that is characterized by self-possession, and thus the laughter would only be a laughter at someone or something that bears an uncanny resemblance to the aggressive laughter of the classical tradition. The laugher does not want or expect something from the laughee, and the laughee only passively holds forth the occasion for the laughter. From the point of view of the other, the one who's being laughed at, things are a bit more interesting, as the experience of being the object of love or being laughed at challenges the self-possession of the other. The other cannot any longer, if the other receives the gift of love or laughter, remain in control, but has to open to the experience of receiving something. Perhaps the laughter is an act of aggression that violently forces itself upon the laughee. But perhaps again, the laughter is really an act of grace that forces the laughee to give up its self-centered and ultimately delusional pretensions of control. If there is a laughter of love, then at least the other, the laughee, in the agapeic relationship of love is being recreated in the strong sense, that is, not only refreshed but constituted anew, as a self that has made the experience of self-alienation central to itself. Erotic love is definitely a human capability or possibility, but also here the unilateral directionality limit the efficacy of any possible erotic laughter. Here, the object of love can in principle remain unperturbed as the wants and yearnings of the lover are of little or no consequence to it. If the object of love, untroubled by the desire of the lover, laughs at this lover, we can assume that this is a laughter not of love, but a mocking laughter. On the side of the loving self, however, things can be more or less interesting. If the desire of the self in the erotic relationship is only meant to fill a lack in the self through the other, then the self can, in principle, remain in control, as the other is only used as a means within a selfish economy of possession. But if the loving self truly cannot be or want to be itself without the other, then the other is not just a piece in the self-constituting commerce of the lover, but the self is recreated by the excess of the other. The laughter of the beloved can be just mocking, but it can also be the occasion of an insight in the foolishness of love on behalf of the loving self. A fool is a person that is not in possession of him or herself, and thus a self that is laughable in the eyes of others. At the same time, the fool is a self that is able, through its very foolishness, to become aware of its need to receive the gift of love from the other to become itself. It is a self that cannot be itself except through the love of the other. And laughter can be a reminder, however painful, of this foolishness that makes the self truly eccentric in the sense of a self that stands outside of itself. Thus, the loving self, laughter can be a force of recreation in the strong sense, where the experience of self-alienation becomes central to the self. I am aware that this account of the possibility of an agapeic laughter of love or an erotic laughter of love is quite abstract and schematic. But the reason for this is to distinctly show forth how the possibility of a recreation of the self is an essential aspect of a possible laughter of love. A genuine laughter of love is not just a laughter between friends that leaves the self as it is. Such a symmetric reciprocity only gives rise to recreation in the weak sense. If a laughter of love is possible, then this laughter must be a laughter that recreates the self in a stronger sense than this. Thus, this laughter can only be a laughter that have no pretensions of exposing the vulnerability of the self or the other, but must share at least some features with an aggressive laughter. A central such feature would be that it is actually directed against the object of laughter, and in this directedness can disturb the laughee in some existentially fundamental way. The philosopher William Desmond holds out the prospect of something related when he proposes that some forms of laughter can be both violent and loving, and illustrates how. A joke at our own expense can make us strangers to ourselves, and yet this being strange shows up more intimately. As Desmond notes, such a laughter can well be an aggressive laughter that betrays or destroys rather than exposes the self that is the object of laughter. The possibilities of an aggressive and a loving laughter are close parallels, however, if the possibility of a strong sense of a recreation of the self should not be frustrated at the outset. The other in the agapeic relationship of love, and also the self in some versions of an erotic relationship of love, are characterized by precisely this loss of self-possession that is a consequence also of the asymmetric understanding of laughter. The reason that a laughter can be both violent and loving at the same time is that it can be violent in the sense that it exposes the illusory self-possession of a self, but in a way that does not annihilate the self. A laughter that causes the self to lose itself altogether can be characterized as only violent and not loving, as this constitutes an experience of alienation without any affirmation. A laughter, on the other hand, that is only affirmative and not in any way alienating, is not a loving laughter, but a recreative laughter in the weak sense, in that it never questions or challenges the self-possession of the laughing self. A truly loving laughter, then, must be a laughter that includes some aspects of violence, inverted commas, in the sense that it challenges any delusional sense of being a self that is in possession of itself. This challenge, however, is experienced as the occasion of a strong recreation of the self, rather than the annihilation of the self, and thus strikes a balance between alienation and affirmation. In the loving laughter, the challenge that causes the alienation of the self takes place against the hopeful horizon of a more fundamental affirmation of the self as another. The phenomenological deficiency of the typological account of agapeic and erotic love is not their asymmetry, but their lack of reciprocity. Love as an asymmetric reciprocity can exceed an economy of exchange, and consequently the laughter of love should also be understood as an excess in the relation to the symmetric reciprocity of laughter between friends. As I have just mentioned, a loving laughter that strikes a balance between alienation and affirmation is premised on a horizon of hope. A hope that the laughter is not only an aggressive laughter that causes pure alienation on behalf of the self, but also an affirmative laughter that can recreate the self as another. This premise includes a reciprocity between self and other that avoids reducing self and other to two self-sufficient and self-possessive entities. But this reciprocity must not be symmetrical, so as not to reduce the relation between self and other to an economic exchange. In the story of Sarah in Genesis, there are several different kinds of laughter. A mocking laughter, a nervous laughter, but most of all, and in the end, an affirmative laughter that is also a contagious and therefore a social laughter, at the prospect of receiving a child as the ultimate gift. And I quote from Genesis chapter 21 verse 6, "God has made laughter for me. Everyone who hears will laugh with me." God has made laughter for me. The source of laughter lies outside of Sarah's own self. It is gifted. The occasion of laughter is not unambiguous, as Sarah has her doubts about the divine giver's sincerity, as well as her own capability of bearing a child at her advanced age. But in a final laughter, these alienating features are overcome in an affirmation of gift, giver and reciprocity. Sarah's laughter is an illustration of a laughter that exceeds an economy of exchange and is a candidate of being a laughter of love in its balance of alienation and affirmation, through which she is being recreated in the strong sense. Concluding shortly, then, most of our laughter, I suppose, takes place within an economy of exchange. There are, of course, also today many examples of aggressive laughter that does not take place against the horizon of a broader affirmation, and therefore are just humiliating. The modern age is not necessarily better in the sense of being more sensitive than the classical age, even if we probably think we are. But there is also a lot of laughter that seems to have an important function for social cohesion, and which are of the recreative kind in the weak sense. Such laughter might occasion a final question with regard to the possible laughter of love, namely, if such a laughter really is very desirable, given the risk of being abused by laughter. Further, is it really a very desirable prospect to be constantly recreated through laughter? Perhaps laughter among friends is a more attractive option. especially if we acknowledge that being in control or possession of oneself sometimes might be a very good thing. I would not have been able to have this talk if I had not been most days in possession of myself, nor would I have lasted very long at my work at the university. The self-controlled and self-possessed scholarly self that I am, then, might sometimes need a little comic relief, and the laughter shared among friends might strengthen the bond between colleagues. Should we not also ask whether the laughter among friends sometimes could work as a screen to protect us against the violence of a loving laughter, to keep us from constantly standing out of ourselves? The short answer to all these legitimate questions would be, I think, that it is not a question of either or. The recreating laughter of love should be understood as the horizon and the condition of possibility of the more common recreational laughter among friends. If our existence ultimately is born by love as an asymmetric reciprocity, then the symmetric reciprocity of friendship is the penultimate reception of that more radical gift. It is not a question of being either friends or lovers, as it is possible to be both at the same time. A friendship nourished by the constant possibility and actuality of love. Laughter among friends might not be the same thing as a laughter of love. Laughter among friends, laughter among friends might not be the same thing as a laughter of love, but the way a laughter of love is being managed to make it more bearable for us. Recreation in the weak sense might look trivial, but not if it reminds us of how we continuously are being recreated in the strong sense by love. Concluding with what this means in terms of a philosophical and/or theological anthropology, what then is the answer to the question that I asked in the introduction to this talk? What kind of being must a human being be to be able to find something funny? Summarizing my argument, I would suggest that such a being is not a being that is defined by self-possession, but that endures the challenge of precisely this possession of itself. It is a subjectivity beyond self-control, a being that lets go of itself and thus in some way exists outside of itself, vulnerable to the other. Such an eccentric existence, as we could call it, is not, however, an existence where the self is completely annihilated by the other, but rather a self that is recreated, and thus strikes a balance between alienation and affirmation. It is a self that exists as itself even in the experience of being outside of itself, even perhaps receiving itself as a gift from the other in contrast to possessing itself. This is an ambivalent self that experiences itself in the laughter of love as affirmed, not only despite its ambivalence, but in its ambivalence and as ambivalent. Such an understanding of the human self or person has many implications in terms of ethics, politics, theology, and so on, but those have to wait for another occasion. Such a mundane phenomenon as laughter has profound implications for the understanding of what it means to be a human being. The conclusion of this talk will be that the kind of being that a human being must be to be able to find something funny is a self that is itself as another. Being human is being ambivalent, vulnerable, and receptive. Thank you.
I thank very much to our speaker for this excellent lecture in this most clear and very well presented form. As the respondent who I am now, I find myself in the rather unfortunate situation to agree with our speaker too much, not only as regards the overall thesis, especially towards the end, the conclusion, but also as regards the style of its presentation. And I think we could now go at length into the details, the conceptual details of the argument, but I'm somehow afraid that our Chinese friends might then laugh at us as we are taking a European, or more particularly a British perspective as a universal, and that is of course not what it is. So I thought, how could we bring in some tension, despite the fact of nevertheless agreeing? Of course, to build up a dialogue requires that tension. So it would be interesting to have, of course, our Chinese listeners to bring in their Chinese perspective. I'm not qualified to raise those issues, but I hope you will take the opportunity in the Q&A session to participate that perspective, to contribute that perspective. My main response then is somehow, or strategy for my response then is somehow to add to the context of the laughter of love. So somehow to put that in a different frame, to reframe it mostly in the terms of scientific anthropology, as our speaker has mapped it as an anthropology of theology and philosophy. Because I think there is a key difficulty to approach the topic we have here through the perspective of the history of ideas. So looking at it as something that has been talked about by thinkers. So we are somehow then only, of course, seeing what those thinkers have said about the problem, or the phenomenon, rather than the phenomenon itself. So we somehow observe in the history of ideas the phenomenon at one remove, at least, through the ages. And that could be a problem if there is a wide gap between what has been written and said in the tradition and the role of laughter we experience in real life. Now, I would like to suggest that there is such a gap between somehow the orthodox tradition that is arguing against laughter, and that has been mapped most clearly by our speaker as the form of aggressive laughter, and the other social functions which can ascribed to it. Nevertheless, it is of course clear that this is not the responsibility of our speaker, that orthodoxy has got its take on laughter as it has done. Yeah, I rather think the contribution of our speaker's talk today is one particularly important contribution, is somehow to clear the conceptual ground, to allow for a fresh start, to allow for fresh thinking on this very important topic indeed. Nevertheless, it's of course clear that orthodoxy has, as Dieter Borchmeier put it in his theological contribution to laughter, has always said, laughter, so have many of its enemies emphasized time and again, is that of the devil. So it's a pronounced somehow aversion to laughter as it is ascribed then to the devil. And that has found in its expression, of course, not only in the textbooks of philosophers and theologians, but rather also in great works of art, literature, music, to just name a few, maybe Wagner's Ring or Goethe's Faust. And of course, as when it comes to music, the famous Paganini Caprice number 13. And I thought to refresh our ears, I suggest that we listen to this Paganini Caprice now, which is commonly referred to as the devil's laughter. So let me try whether I can somehow now link you up with that. So share sound. So I hope this came through. Did it? Yes, I see a nod of the speaker, so I assume that got through. It's of course, so that was the Devil's Laughter of Paganini. It's of course not so clear who is laughed at here, whether it's the public who thinks that after the introduction of the double stops, that was the difficult part, because then of course the really difficult part starts, or whether the laughter of the devil is somehow expressed towards the violinist who has to go through it after somehow starting with this lightly amusing chuckle in the beginning of the piece. And I might suggest as well that if you can play it as well as Julia Fischer can play it, you laugh somehow back at the devil because you are again in full control and mastery over the situation. Okay, so that's as a refreshment of the orthodox position of aggressive laughter, even here pronounced with its diabolic signum. But nevertheless, I think that somehow the emphasis of the orthodoxy of aggressive laughter is somehow, to put it a little bit strongly, woefully incomplete. And just to somehow briefly preview the problem here, if you look at how laughter is analyzed and only look at the paradigm situation that is sketched, or as it was said in the presentation, the basic laughing relationship, that is commonly thought as one between an I and a you, or a laugher and a laughee, whereby the I laughs at someone else, so I laugh at you, or then in the variation somehow coming in with the British tradition, as said that it was somehow embraced as a I laugh with you. But that of course is still a very, very limited account of a laughing situation. We only need to somehow stretch that by changing the pronoun into a plural and make it a group. So you could talk about we laugh at something, we laugh at you, we laugh at them. Both is a different situation already. You can, of course, also then say, we laugh with someone, we laugh with you, we laugh with them. But even more, you can change that and you can say, for instance, you laugh about something. So not emphasizing that you laugh at or with someone, but that you laugh about something. So I laugh about something. It might be myself, it might be you, I laugh about you, and that might not be the same as to laugh at someone. That can be, of course, also be a plural, a group activity again. We can laugh about something together as a group. We can laugh again, if we have an opponent to that, we can laugh about you. We can laugh about them. And the connotations that each of this formulation carries with it are, of course, different. Another variation would be that you do laugh off something. So you laugh off something like you try to shake off an embarrassment by doing that together. However, no matter whether it is at or with or about, the perspective on laughter that is taken in such way is to think about laughter as an intellectual capacity. So laughter here connects to thought and is considered to be a feature of rational beings only. So to find something funny, or in order that you can laugh at or you laugh with or about, you have to have the capacity for rational thought. Therefore, as Roger Scruton put it in an early essay on laughter, man is the only animal that laughs. But of course, Roger Scruton also concedes that laugh is at the same time a sound or can be considered as a sound only, a sound that is also made by animals as a kind of vocal communication. And this is somewhat the entry point for now a scientific anthropology. So anthropology that works from a scientific perspective. The relevant field here is that looks into laughter is especially the research on communication science and biology. And I think a look into that research is actually highly informative to frame the relationship of laughter and laugh. And I think just in this kind of direction that the speaker was suggesting towards the end of his presentation. Now, this scientific research on laughter researches, of course, laughter as a sound. So they define laughter by an acoustic structure. So an acoustic structure with features I don't now specify in detail here, but for instance, that it has a stable sequence of vowels within a laugh bout, but rather than having alternating vowels. So a laughter then sounds, of course, like a ha, 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 and not a ha, he, ha. Yeah, so that's, for instance, one particular feature that is belongs to the definition of the laughter. And another thing is that this sound can, of course, especially in humans, we know that we can produce that voiced, or we can produce it unvoiced. So a voiced laughter is the one I just produced now, so that you would actively somehow produce it. And the distinction between a voiced and unvoiced laughter is important again, as this opens the perspective for laughter that is perceived faked, yeah, so that you have faked laughter, and laughter that seems to be genuine and spontaneous. And this already affects how then the social communication is judged by the recipients of the laughter. What the branch of research further then is going into is the phylogeny of laughter. So that's the branch of research researching how a particular feature, a species, or a particular feature of a species has evolved. And for laughter, that consists into look into the related species producing sounds that have the same acoustic structure as human laughter. And of course, that's mainly looking into the vocal communication of great apes and primates. And the research in this field suggests that the human laughter actually derives from so-called play vocalizations in non-human primates. Now, what does, so sounds that non-human primates are doing as they are playing with each other. So what does such a play vocalization signal? And I quote, it signals that it provides, laughter is a signal that provides honest information about the physical state of the participants and reveals vulnerability. The continued play indicates a willingness to be vulnerable, trust in the social partner, and an investment in the action itself. You already may have sharpened your ears on those keywords that all of a sudden we talk here about vulnerability, trust, and cooperation, which is of course quite different from an aggressive understanding of laughter. This kind of play vocalizations are of course then through the evolution taken up in the situation of the human species into a much more complexer and broader setting of communication and contexts of communication that involve language and emotion. And this is the place then where research also, but only here, introduces or includes the so-called darker side of laughter, as they call it, such as taunting and ironic laughing that can be quite hostile and aggressive to particular targets, end of quote. Now, what is the point of somehow introducing this kind of scientific take on the matter here? It is, of course, a major frame shift, and I think that's the point I would like to make by using it here. If the history of ideas is taken as the reference point, what we have is somehow the main frame is the aggressive laughter, or the orthodoxy that is arguing against laughter. And what we try to do is somehow to, in this larger frame, to carve out an edge or a corner that we can then call the laughter of love. As Aristotle, it was pointed out in the speech, Aristotle took the aggressive laughter as the natural starting point. So the natural starting point is that. But if we look into scientific research, that picture is somehow turned upside down, or rather the picture is just completely reframed, as here somehow the starting point that we take, the main frame, is a laughter as a signal that is positive, that shows affection, cooperative intent, vulnerability. And within that larger frame, we then carve out or write into the darker side of laughter. That affects then, of course, how the social functions of laughter are researched and mapped in the research on communicative science. An important distinction there comes between exclusive and inclusive laughter. So the exclusive laughter is, of course, then mostly aligned with somehow the darker side of laughter, so that you will, by laughing at someone, you exclude that person. But on the other hand, you have then, of course, from somehow the ancestral function of laughter, a huge space for an inclusive laughter as well between humans. So a laughter that signals affiliation, that signals cooperative intention, that is a form of play, as it is said, that also might be a polite laughter or a form of submission. Interestingly, this kind of ability to relate to a positive understanding of laughter seems to be deeply ingrained in the human species. Cross-cultural studies of babies who were but 5 months old were made listen to recordings of laughter, recordings that had shown or made them to hear laughters between friends on the one hand and strangers on the other. And it appears from that research, at least, that those babies were not only able to distinguish these two different kinds of laughter, but they actually preferred to listen to the laughter between friends. So that brings me then back to Roger Scruton and his suggestion that man is the only animal that laughs, as he is emphasizing on rationality. And I may say, of course, sure, but it is nevertheless highly interesting to see how the inclusive and cooperative and affectionate roots of the animal laughter come to resonate in the philosopher's own words. And I quote here now Roger Scruton to conclude. So he writes, "It is difficult to love a great man with the warmth of normal human relations. In order to do so, it may be necessary to find in him that which can be, however gently, laughed at. A truly great spirit will no doubt be willing to exchange the absolute security of the unlaughable for the comfort of human affection. Else like Christ, he must think of himself as divine in order to bear his inner isolation. And by that, I would like to conclude my very brief remarks. I hope this was of some interest to our speaker. I would like to say again, this was, I think, the best I could do for reasons that I thought his paper is very, very agreeable to me. And I might bring in a first question. Of course, I leave it to our speaker to pick up on anything I've said before. But my one thing that when I was thinking about the topic was of particular interest to me is somehow whether we should also, from a theological point of view, because I'm not the systematic theologian here, and therefore I take the opportunity to raise such a question, whether we might need to bring in a pneumatology as well. So given that we have not only in the philosophical and theological tradition, but also in a scientific perspective, we have a great support for a good case, a strong case for a positive side of laughter. Might we need to consider that somehow from a pneumatological perspective, as we would say that love and friendship are somehow gifts of the spirit? And shouldn't we also consider a laughter as a very, very important gift of the spirit? And how would that somehow relate maybe between those three concepts? So that would be my first question.
Thank you very much. I must reciprocate and say that I agree with almost everything you say in your response. But let me just, I promise to be very brief and have just two remarks. And the first one is about scientific anthropology. And I think it's I haven't read that particular those quotes you gave, but it resonates very well with what I'm trying to say, because my point is not that the history of idea delivers these answers to what laughter is, but I think we have to think through history, but with the help of phenomenology you will try to uncover what kind of options there really are beyond the quite narrow square of the history of ideas, and in an even longer speech that I already had, I would have taken up the question of play, because it's obvious to me that the humor and laughter has to do with play and being a playful self, and that vulnerability of the playful self that those scientific anthropologists point to is of course a part of that kind of laughter that is not just laughing at something, but is involved in laughter, and so is making itself vulnerable to laughter. So it agrees very well with what I'm saying. But my hesitation with scientific anthropology when they deal with humor is they often take for granted some kind of idea of humor and laughter. I don't know about the research that you're quoting, but some of it are thinking that humor is, we all know what it is, so we can start to talk about it scientifically, and that's not the case. So I think even scientific anthropology needs to be informed by phenomenology, and vice versa. Of course, it's not a one-way street, but I would I'd love to have the references for that, because that's really interesting. In Robert Beller's book on religion, he suggests that on religion and evolution, he suggests that also religion starts with play, which sort of puts religion and playfulness and even laughter closer to each other than is traditionally being done. And just then a very brief remark on pneumatology. If we would want to have a theology of laughter, would that not be a pneumatology? And I think you're right. And strangely enough, there's actually one 20th century theologian that have done just this, namely Karl Barth, the Swiss theologian, in his lectures on ethics from, I think, 1928 to 1929, when he is there he has 10 pages on humor, which is within the pneumatology, and the reason is that the Spirit gives us. It's not that we, if we are filled with Spirit, this means that we're not only doing something, but we even love doing it, and we love laughing, and therefore we are spirit-filled, so to speak. So Karl Barth is actually quite. I was a bit surprised when I read that, and there's also another 10 pages elsewhere, but he's quite profound and quite original in that sense. All hails to Swiss theology. But I think I stop there, and should I then maybe start answering the questions we have in the Q&A?
The opportunity to our speakers. So I have here a first question which has been typed already during the lecture, and which I think we could try to answer. We cannot find Jesus' laugh in the Bible. Is it because laughter has been understood as antagonistic, or is it, or it has been understood as losing self-control? Thank you. I hope you can you do something for that?
Yeah, sure. I think this is a very interesting question. One couldn't answer it very long, but I'll try to be brief. I think it's because laughter has been understood as antagonistic, not because he is losing self-control, because neither Jesus nor the disciples in the Gospels are that kind of human beings that are afraid to lose their self-control. The disciples do it all the time. And of course, Jesus is also showing himself vulnerable in the passion. And so the reason is definitely not that he was afraid of losing self-control. So but there is a hesitancy in the early Christian tradition of saying they're hesitant towards laughter. I think the main reason is because it was seen as antagonistic or aggressive, and so when the soldiers mock Jesus at the cross, that was seen as a scene of mockery and antagonistic and aggressive laughter. But at the same time, there's a lot of humor in the Bible, and there's in the letters of Paul, he speaks of the disciples as fools for Christ, which has an immense impact on the tradition later on. And in the Middle Ages, there was even a quite profound discussion of whether Jesus, even though he didn't laugh actually in the Bible, where he could have laughed. And the Orthodox answer was, well, yes, of course, because they took up Aristotle's saying that the human is the only being that can laugh. That Scruton quote you had is from Aristotle, and so if Jesus is the perfect human and fully human, then of course he also must have the ability to laugh. But in the writings we have from the Gospels and the Church Fathers and the Middle Age, what we do have are literary expressions of a certain kind that were quite hesitant of taking up such a thing as laughter, which was considered low. So it's not until the 15th and 16th century when Christian and other writers really start to write about laughter. So there's a sudden development where the Christian Gospels actually do have an impact on the understanding of laughter in the history of ideas.
Excellent. I think we'll venture now one of the questions that has been raised in Chinese, which might be a challenge for us to break down. Would you like to maybe go into it you directly rather than me translating it? So maybe here it's the fourth question now. In Chinese culture, laugh seems
Yeah.
value and so on. This one.
Okay, would you like me to translate it into Chinese? Or?
Okay. I can read it.
I think it's a little bit difficult from the translation. Mao Zheng, could you maybe rephrase the question directly as you understand it, from, that you somehow vocally raise that question directly rather than typing it down, as you interpret it with your understanding of it? Because from reading the translation, it seems to be a little bit difficult for us to grasp.
Yeah.
I have some difficulties reading it too. Sorry, I'm reading it now. I think this question is, the student tries to relate it to laughter to Tao.
Mm-hmm. Yes. And what is the particular link that is suggested between the Tao and laughter?
It seems Chinese elites somehow like the Greek elite, they think love is not so decent, love is moderate, so that's the worst way to achieve Tao.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think. I obviously I don't know that much about the Tao Te Ching, so I can't really say something about that. But let me say something about the ancient Greek philosophers, because according to Plato and Aristotle, especially Aristotle, there's a certain hierarchy in drama. So tragedy speaks about the high things, the noble things, in a noble way, whereas comedy speaks about the low things in a low language. And that kind of this stylistic preference was developed all through the ancient European tradition as well as the medieval tradition. So there's always been a consideration that laughter and comedy and humor is something low, whereas the noble things, the eternal things are more the tragedy that is supposed to write about. Now, what's interesting in the Western tradition is actually that the Gospels themselves, they turn this upside down. So they're speaking of high things in a low style, and that kind of mixing of styles also came to have an effect on European style ideals later on. So when we come to the 14th century Renaissance and the 15th century Renaissance and the 16th century Renaissance, was much more of a mix. So it was then possible to speak of important things in a funny way, which was considered not doable for neither the ancient philosopher nor, for that matter, the ancient theologian. So those church fathers like John Chrysostom that I mentioned and Clement of Alexandria, they still adhered to this classic ideal of the hierarchical genres of tragedy and comedy. And maybe there's something similar going on in the Tao Te Ching. I don't know. That's a question and not a statement, because it seems that seems to, even though it's in the Western tradition that has, in the 16th century it was much more of a mix. Even today, humor and laughter is not considered as an important academic topic. It's considered as something frivolous and so on. And nevertheless, it is an ubiquitous and very important human trait that we laugh at things. That's maybe a speculation that this could be something that is more general than just the Western tradition.
Okay, thank you. And the student, I think he mentioned that Tao in Chinese means you, after hearing that, you must transform it into practice.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't understand how he or she related to Christ.
Well, I suppose that what Christ preaches according to the Gospels is also something that the disciples are supposed to put in practice. So there's obviously a performative moment of the Gospels themselves. Maybe.
Yeah.
I just take up quickly on what you have said last, because I think, I mean, we are somehow now more universal perspective, and I think just on that point, also to look into scientific anthropology might be interesting. It again provides you somehow the broader view, maybe having a step towards what are the different situations where you can localize sounds of laughter. So I think that would be another way of going into it. Of course, I would also then quickly, as you have commented on comedy and tragedy, just to fill in that very particularly interesting information, which I'm not sure whether you are aware of, but you know the custom. It's apparently a Burman custom rooting in the Middle Ages of the risus paschalis, so the so-called Easter laughter. And apparently in this tradition, as I think Catholic tradition, is that after the Good Friday, so in the Easter, during the Easter sermon, actually the priest would try to make some joke or some funny, bring some funny kind of behavior in order to make people laugh. And so actually during the most solemn moment of one of the most solemn celebrations of Christian faith, there would be a laughter in the church, yeah, in community. And the idea apparently of this custom is to overcome death by laughing at it.
Mm-hmm.
So that is a particularly interesting custom that somehow brings in story and of comedy at its most solemn moment. So not to see that in conflict, but one very interesting moment to bring the two together.
Yeah, there's a very famous book, as I'm sure you know, about Michel Bachtin's Rabelais and His World, which is Michel Bachtin is a Russian linguist that wrote this very famous book on laughter in the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, and his thesis that there was an elite, non-laughing elite culture, and a laughing folk culture. It's a brilliant book, but unfortunately he's probably just wrong in his historical thesis, because there's always been a mix of the most solemn and the comic in most churches during, I mean, most centuries. So but he thinks that's something that wasn't sanctioned by the institutionalized church, but that's not really true. And so in our age, you always think it's strange that how could they have a laughter in church, because you somehow expect that everything is said in earnest and in a very solemn tone, and historically I don't think that is true. So the Risus Pascale, the Easter laughter, is an example of that. But there's that fools' carnivals in churches and a lot of these things. That's really interesting. There's a question here it's probably directed to you, namely which I would like to hear the answer to too, and namely, is ridiculing allowed in court?
Can I say something about that? Not quite, especially in procedural law, but nevertheless, of course, in anthropology, it's a very important research topic, legal anthropology, about people somehow having what it means to have proceedings in court. And so the importance also of the ritual that justice is being done. So it must also be seen, and it's sometimes, therefore, also a kind of theatre, how judges are dressed and how the roles are taken, and of course, how that proceeds. And you may already see now that there is a kind of parallel to a solemn mass or a service in church. So of course there is also a kind of ritualized way of how you have to behave, and it's not the place where you actually should laugh normally. So that's just as much excluded. And interestingly, of course, it is also a sanction. It can be sanctioned so that you can contempt of court. The sanction a person. Yeah? So if you would somehow laugh, you would go in and laugh at the judge or make a bad joke. That would not only just really greatly diminish your chances of winning a case, but nobody can take that one. But of course, also it would give the possibility for the court to fine you over that joke. So this is not something that is actually meant to happen in such a setting. There needs to be parallel, I think, to what we have said. Also, just to mention that as well, the recent studies has, of course, then been banned by the Pope, hasn't it? Because there was some form of abuse, because apparently in some situations it caused a little bit of the not so proper humor about sexuality. And so this was then ultimately banned by the Pope, so it didn't last forever. But as far as I know, it has been taken up more recently. Should we venture another question, or
yeah,
maybe we have here?
maybe
that Jiaotong is still translating one.
Yeah.
Oh,
Well, I can answer shortly the question about humor as a virtue.
of course, yeah, please.
Because in Aristotle almost say in the Nicomachean Ethic that humor is a virtue. It doesn't explicitly say it, but implicitly. And it's not humor. It's wit. The Greek term is eutrapelia, which means wit. But it's and wit is the golden middle between, on the one hand, being a buffoon, which you shouldn't be because then you lose control, or being too serious. So being witty, and that's a virtue. And so in the tradition of virtue ethics, it's usually actually considered a virtue. So when Aquinas takes it up in the 13th century, for him it's a virtue. And it's a great discussion today whether one should consider humor a virtue, and the answer is most often yes. At least if you're an Aristotelian.
That's very interesting. Yes. Oh, so have we now a translation of the last? Jiaotong, did you just are you still working on the translation about this last question that came in, or?
Sorry, I put it in an answer, so you can see it in the already answered question.
Answers. Okay. So that here is.
That's still the last question. So the question I asked before. So she just raised that question in Chinese.
Aha. Okay.
I'm wondering, may I ask a question?
Yeah, of course. Please do so. A pleasure.
Okay. You mentioned that in theology, love is often related to pneumatology, and I read Politic Systematic Theology Part 4. There's part about pneumatology that it overcomes the ambiguity of life. There are something about like about how how ambiguity is overcome by pneuma, like this. Some areas of life, like self-interpretation, self-recreation, self-transcendence, that remind me of Ola's presentation today about love and laughter. But in theology, love is often a metaphor for God or an attribution of God. And from my understanding, laughter is about human relation. It's an action of human. So there's a huge gap between love and loved. From love is like the real love in Christian theology is often from the God, but laughter is human, it's from human perspective. So that means there is something love can do, but laughter cannot.
Yes, I mean it's good question. I think you're absolutely right. Then one must draw a distinction between what I mean. It is written that God is love, and in that sense, of course, that then laughter as a human reaction or human phenomenon maybe doesn't go into that, because even though I think there are 4 places in the Old Testament where God is actually laughing at humans, so quite an antagonistic laughter, but nevertheless that's a very anthropomorphic image of God. But when I was speaking of love, it was mainly human love, and I'm suggesting that you have to understand love in the New Testament and elsewhere as something that is beyond the distinction between agape and eros. And if so, I think it's possible to laugh with love, but of course laughter doesn't exhaust love, and love is by all accounts much more central to Christianity and to theology than laughter. But one of the expressions of love could be laughter. There are many more expressions too. I mean, just because I've been doing research on laughter doesn't mean I think laughter is everything. I mean, I don't think even though human beings are humorous and it's important being humorous, humor isn't everything. There's definitely other aspects too, and I think it's important to say that. But what has been, from an academic perspective, interesting about doing research on humor is that it's come into questions of both God and of human beings from a bit unusual perspective. So you may see things that you wouldn't have seen if you just chose a more, traditional discussion. So, but that doesn't mean that humor and laughter is everything. Not at all.
Okay, thank you very much.
Well, then, I think this is a great harvest of this presentation, and as I'm afraid this is where we have to end it, having looked if that time is over now. So let me take the opportunity again to thank Professor Ola Sigurdson for this excellent presentation, and to all of you for contributing to it, to Mahjong for the translation, and of course to the ISCS for organizing this lecture series.